Welcome everyone to the HPS.CESEE Global Book Talk. HPS.CESEE is a platform on history and philosophy of science in Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, which was founded 1.5 years ago, and we are more or less once a month, we are organizing book talks in which we present books which cannot be presented now because of the COVID, but sometimes they cannot be presented for such a large audience because we were and are always bound by our places. So we thought that we'll be doing it in online venue even before it was fashionable. And now we are doing it online because we have to. And I'm very happy that in our today's meeting, we have a discussion about the book Science in the Metropolis, Vienna in Transnational Context, 1848-1918, which is edited by Mitchell Ash. And we'll discuss it with Dorothee Brantz from Berlin and Oliver Hochadel from Barcelona. I'm also very happy because I was at this conference. I never delivered the paper, although it's quoted in the introduction, but I really enjoyed the papers which were discussed there and the presentations, and I really think that it gives a lot of material for very good discussion, and also it's a very good material for other studies which will follow in the very same way of the at the crossroad of urban history and history of science. And I'm very happy that Mitchell Ash will be presenting the book. So I don't know whether I have to present Mitch, but I would just say that Mitch is a professor emeritus for history of science at the University of Vienna. And now I think visiting scholar at Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin. And he published on a lot of topics from the crossroads of the history of politics in Europe and in the recent Central Europe, on the history of interdisciplinarity, one of the recent articles, history of space, and history of science and nationalism, which is a volume both of us edited in 2012. And his most recent book is exactly the book we'll be discussing today. And Mitch, I would propose that we start with you and the presentation of the book.
Thank you very much, Jan, and warm greetings to many old friends who, as I see, are listening in and attending this Zoom meeting. I'm very happy to see such names, which I will not now name because I'm sure I'll forget someone, but I'm very happy to see you all here today. Can you hear me? First of all, let me just be sure.
Yes.
Excellent. I will try to keep these remarks as brief as I can. The first point is that the title of the book is Science in and not Science and the Metropolis. That is a clue to what we seek to do. And I say we because this is not the royal we, this is a collective endeavor by all of us together. I'm just the editor. I was more or less the superintendent that brought these articles together. But what I'm going to say now comes from the introduction to the volume. As you all know, the history of science in cities has become a very popular topic in recent years for very good reasons, because the ways that urban settings have enabled the rise of modern science is indeed an important, indeed to some extent even a central topic. This particular volume is intended to be a dual contribution to the history of science in large cities, mostly focused until recently on colonial metropoles like Paris, London, and to some extent Berlin, by adding a fourth metropole, Vienna, to the mix. A metropole that deserves the name because it was, like the others, the capital of an empire and the center of finance and culture of that empire, although this was an inland European empire rather than an overseas empire. Second, the book is intended to be a contribution by linking up with the field of urban history called Metropolitan Studies to contribute to the ongoing discussion about what exactly constitutes a metropolis and how such a place differs from other large cities. I'm going to leave that part of the discussion to Dorothee Brantz because that is her field. The important point I want to emphasize here is that both the concept of metropolis and the concept of science, especially metropolitan science, are what I like to call moving targets. That is to say, they are in dynamic interaction and in constant motion. So it's difficult to say what each of them is in the sense of being the same over time, because they change over time. In my own introduction, I try to be a touch more specific by suggesting that the establishment of a network of large-scale state-funded scientific research projects after 1848, coupled with the reform of existing academic institutions and the later emergence of a privately funded set of research institutes and popular scientific associations, led, taken together, to the creation of what I call a metropolitan infrastructure in the sciences and in the city of Vienna itself, that was a precondition of the well-studied cultural phenomenon known as Vienna 1900. Recent research has elaborated multiple linkages of natural, medical, and social sciences, as well as the humanities, with that phenomenon of Vienna 1900, which I can't go into detail about here. This book is intended in part to help us to understand why those contributions came to exist, although I hasten to add that the topic here is not the intellectual antecedents of all of these contributions, but rather what made that outburst of creativity possible at all. The central question of this volume, therefore, is how that shared metropolitan space made possible new interurban, regional, and transnational linkages of academic and non-academic researchers, along with new efforts to make the sciences accessible to wider publics in the emerging Habsburg metropole in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and how these dynamics compared to and also became interlinked with metropolitan science and technology in other European and North American centers. By the concept of metropolitan scientific infrastructures, I mean physical things like buildings, streets, and the like, networks of various kinds, but also human interactions in regional, transnational, but also local contexts, all of which taken together and in interaction with one another enabled the emergence of what was then called and still can be called a scientific research landscape encompassing a variety of locations for the training of research of scholars and scientists, but also their meeting one to exchange knowledge with one another in physical places. Speaking in this way implies taking a particular approach to the topic, one that emphasizes networks of power, technology, and knowledge. Such infrastructures can take a variety of forms. One of these emphasizes technical infrastructures like the Ringstrasse and what underlay it quite literally and physically, but we can also talk about other kinds of infrastructures, such as what I like to call spaces of knowledge in Vienna. And I will only name now the kinds of spaces of knowledge that I elaborate further in the introduction. Physical spaces, which are important in the case of Vienna because the institutions, the major institutions of scientific knowledge production and distribution in Vienna were mostly, not all, but mostly within walking distance of one another, which is really quite unusual for a metropolis the size of Vienna. There are also to be geographical, political, and social spaces of knowledge that could be discussed here. The geographical spaces of knowledge are not just the local ones, but also regional connections within the Habsburg monarchy of the kind that Oliver Hochadel might say a few words about. Social spaces involve, of course, connections within the elites, the scientific and other elites, first of all, the scientific elites and the liberal nobility that enabled them to produce themselves in places like scientific and other societies, but also other kinds of social spaces, such as the spaces for working class education embodied by the Volksheim and Otterkring in the working class district of Vienna, not in the same place as the places where the elites met, but a very important place for the transfer or distribution, to be more precise, of scientific knowledge at the turn of the century in Vienna. So when we talk about spaces of knowledge, I refer at least to all of those. And the transnational dimension is given in many different ways. One of the best known ways is the expedition of the Novara, the sailing ship that was sent around the world commanded by, or under the command of the head of the Imperial Navy, to gather scientific specimens in huge numbers, which were then transferred to the Natural History Museum for study. That is to say, transnational objects were transferred then to the capital of the empire and studied in the imperial metropolis. So that's one way of talking about geographical and social spaces together. But in addition, one can do this in many other different ways as well. But I'm not going to go into those details because we don't have time. I will just say a word now about the chapters in the volume. They connect in various ways to the conceptual framework of social spaces or different kinds of spaces that I've just tried to sketch. Part 1 contains 2 historiographical overviews, opening with Dorothee Brantz's chapter entitled Metropolitan Natural Histories, Inventing Science, Building Cities, and Displaying the World. Oliver Hochadel's historiographical reflections on the urban history of science more broadly can be seen as a pendant to Dorothee's analysis. The chapters in Part 2 analyze the creation of technical and scientific infrastructures in the metropolis from the 1850s to the 1870s from 2 complementary perspectives. In his chapter, Sándor Békésy from the Vienna Museum describes the beginnings of infrastructural expansion in Vienna following the failed revolution of 1848, particularly the major urban development projects leading up to and following the construction of the famous Ringstrasse. Taken together, all of them led to the creation of what he calls an urban machine. And the important part here is that this all has a transnational dimension because it wasn't just local firms involved in providing the technology and doing the construction work. In her chapter, Marianne Klemoun illustrates how such overlapping knowledges worked in practice. Focusing on the work of geologist and politician Eduard Suess, she shows that what she terms metropolitan geology played a dual role, providing basic research on Vienna's subterranean spaces and geological structures that proved useful for infrastructure projects, such as the freshwater pipeline from the Alps. Part 3 presents comparative studies of Vienna and other metropoles, as well as analyses of metropolitan networks and transnational knowledge circulation, beginning in the 1870s and continuing into the 1900s. Ulrike Spring focuses on the Austro-Hungarian expeditions to the Arctic in the mid-1870s, led by officers Karl Weibrecht and Julius Payer, and the immensely popular public presentation of their results, first in Habsburg and in Hamburg and then in Vienna. Rejecting any linear model of knowledge transmission between container-like spaces or from academic to public media, Spring suggests that it is more appropriate to speak of entangled spaces of knowledge in such contexts. In the following chapter, Petr Svatek takes a comparative approach, comparing the networks in the geographical sciences established in the universities of the 2 metropolitan capital cities, Vienna and Berlin, around 1900, with one another. In her chapter, Brooke Penelosa-Patzak examines transnational fin de siècle networks established by Franz Boas and others in the United States, Berlin, and Vienna for the circulation and exchange of ethnographic artifacts. She compares the ethnographic collections in the capital cities Berlin and Vienna and shows how these and American metropolitan museums, as well as the World Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, became spaces of and media for the transfer of practical skills, methods, and theoretical approaches that came to define the new field of cultural anthropology. Part 4 returns finally the focus back to Vienna with studies of the circulation of knowledge amongst the metropole's varied social spaces in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Johannes Mattes examines popular scientific societies, spatial transformations of the city, and their impact on the development of knowledge-based public spheres. In the final chapter, Christian Stifter discusses the role of the sciences in the adult education movement in Vienna at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. As he shows, bourgeois liberals, among them leading academics and social democrats, formed a unique alliance in Vienna, bridging class boundaries by enlisting members of the educated middle class and urban elites to establish popular education associations for working people. The crown jewel of these efforts was the so-called People's Halls, or Volksheim, in the district of Ottakring that I already mentioned. For Stifter, the Volksheim was a heterotope, an alternative social space in the sense defined by Michel Foucault, and thus in a certain sense, a political project, even though the abstinence from party politics was necessary to make it happen at all. I hope I have provided a sufficiently clear overview of the content of our volume and at least some of the concepts that have been used to unify a wide range of topics, disciplinary studies, and spatial locations. And now I would like Dorothee Brantz to continue once Jan has introduced her. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitch, for this great introduction of the volume. And now, as you said, I will give the voice to Dorothee Brantz, who is professor and director of the Center for Metropolitan Studies at the Technical University of Berlin. And she provided also one of the key concepts for the volume, which is 6 spaces. And I think she will be exactly talking about 6 spaces and how she sees history of science and history of urban history intersects from the point of view of urban historian. So Dorothea, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello, welcome everyone. It's very nice to see at least the pictures of most of you, because I think that's a big advantage of the new digital world, that we actually can come together from different places in a way that we couldn't before. So, and I'm sure if we were to name all the places we're from, we would have quite a kaleidoscope of metropoles and different places. So, and if you can, I would be very happy if you turned on your camera, because it's much nicer to speak to people rather than just to speak, at name signs. So if your internet connection is good enough, because I think that will also help us to feel like we're joining into a conversation. What I want to talk a little bit about, is, as you've seen, from Jan already, it's the wonderful book Science in the Metropolis, and we're very happy to be able to present it today, because this has been quite an endeavor going back to the conference that we all, or at least I know, remember even fonder, because it was one where we actually could get together, and I think a lot of us have now gone through a year and a half of digital conferences, so we know that the thing missing the most from all these digital events is not necessarily content, but it's the stuff in between, the coffee breaks and the dinners, and just being able to talk to people. So I think in retrospect, that makes all the conferences we're able to attend all the nicer, and the exchanges you have. So, but as Mitch already said, this book and the conference that went with it very much engaged the notion of infrastructure, and infrastructure both in the physical and institutional sense, but also in the social. But it also looked at infrastructures as networks, and networks of actors, and actors very widely conceived, right? I mean, we had all kinds of people coming, in through the sort of historical sources during the conference, and also if you read the book, and people, men, women, people in different parts of the world, animals, and so we have a wide sort of potpourri of actors who engage in these networks that make up the metropole. But it's not just about infrastructures, and I think that makes this book very timely, is the notion that it brings together concepts of infrastructures with technology, science, and also the environment. And it brings it together from a very sort of differentiated notion of disciplines. If you look at the book, we have, in there, we have geology, geography, we have, sort of different exhibition cultures, be it ethnographic, natural history, and also what I think was quite important for the conference and then also for the book was the significance of popular education, because it's a very big topic nowadays. If we think about citizen science and engaging and going outside the academy to, sort of also transfer our knowledge exchange to society. And I think what the book shows very nicely is that this is not a new trope. This is something, that was very important in the 19th century and was, institutionalized in many ways in the 19th century through all kinds of different institutions that, many of which the book presents. And the book does that in the context of thinking, how does it have to, or how does it play into the notion of metropolitan growth? So urbanization in a particular context. And I have my perspective on what I think, the metropolis is. Oliver Hochadel will present us his perspective, which I always thought was very interesting because he looks both from the vantage point of the center and the periphery. So to understand, kind of the complexity of the metropole, because I think it's already somewhat, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, sort of the notion of the metropole or the metropolis sort of suggests almost two different things. Or if you talk about the metropolitan region or whichever, terms you kind of want to use. But I want to focus here particularly on what is termed in the subtitle of the book, the notion of the transnational, because the book is framed as a transnational perspective on science in the metropolis. And what this suggests to us is that the metropolis is not just sort of an internal container that we can understand if we look at different aspects within the city, but that we also have to take an external perspective. We have to look at it from the outside to really understand, what is going on. And in my chapter, and I don't want to tell you too much, since of course all of us want that you also read the book. So we want to just maybe give you a little taste to hopefully, get you interested. And I think, Mitch already did a great job introducing us to all the, different chapters. So in my chapter, I talked about natural history museums and zoological gardens in Berlin and Vienna as two specific examples where we can see both the internal development and also the significance of external influences. So in that sense, both the institutions and the institutionalization of natural history and zoological exhibitions in the city of Vienna and the city of Berlin, as a very important moment for cities when they were making the transition from being large cities to becoming metropolitan areas. And we can see this, all across Europe and North America at the time, that, when they kind of tried to make this transition to become metropolitan, that they founded institutions like museums, zoological gardens, and so forth. And it shows us, that sort of these metropolitan characterizations of cities were very much depending on networks that went far beyond the city. Because specimen, in my case, specimen had to be brought to the city. There was a lot of knowledge exchange that made, these institutions possible and then sustained them also over the years. There is a network exchange that leads us to a much broader understanding of the interconnections between the urban and the natural world. And not the least, also between the human and the non-human, and be they animals, plants, and to sort of see this complexity that the metropole by no means is just made up of people and might have been constructed. Well, not even construction, it's just by people. If you think about lots of all the animals that also were included in that, but that is envisioned by people, maybe. But then depends on a much richer, sort of tapestry of life forms to sustain the metropolis. So in that sense, I think we very quickly learned, during the conference, and then also when we read the book now, that the metropole is made up of entanglements, which then sort of raises the question for us, how to do this? How do we study entanglements? And one of the concepts that we tried to play around with during the conference was this notion of thick space. And what is really meant by this? Thick space is leaning on Clifford Geertz's notion of a thick description. So in that sense, both, the very close investigation of a particular event that really tries to analyze and understand the multiple layers that put together any kind of complex interrelationship, right? Because that's what he was trying to understand, but then also with an emphasis on narrative. This is something that we as historians know quite well how to do, or we struggle with, and how to put the things that we discover, the knowledge that we gain into a narrative that then also contributes to this thick description, or thick space, as we called it in this volume. So if we were talking about space then, and Mitch already referred to a lot of different layers of space that we were addressing, So I don't want to repeat that, but I think by spaces we mean as well the physical, and the book addresses, a number of different ones, be they particular buildings, institutions, neighborhoods, physical structures, but also on the level of cities. We're looking at Vienna, we're looking at Hamburg, we're looking at Berlin, we're going all the way to the Arctic. But we're also talking about notions of empire. So the city within an empire, and that's basically, in many ways, that's what the metropole is, right? If there is actually a sort of large, colonial empire or not. But in the case of Vienna, there definitely is notion of empire in this time period. But then also looking at transnational networks. And in the end, a lot of this is about, and these are sort of spaces I think we should consider as well. It's about knowledge about the world, right? So it's a notion of space that also transfers back onto something that reaches not just from the city to its surrounding region, but that reaches all the way to the planetary in many ways, to understand, how do we know the world? As we know, much of the knowledge about the world is actually, sort of generated in cities, not exclusively, but in many ways it was. And these institutions that were founded in the 19th century are very important in this. So in ending then, I just wanted to maybe throw out 3 areas that we could perhaps discuss. So I'd be very interested, what your perspective is on them, because if we talk about the notion of science and if you connect it to an understanding of thick spaces, that of course raises the questions of what is science as a space or the spaces of science. So how do we, sort of get at this notion? And maybe we can discuss that. I would also be very interested, since this is, a workshop on primarily Eastern European history, what, sort of Eastern European cities, how do they play in all of this, right? Because in the book, we look primarily, I guess, at sort of Western European, Central European, Western European. So, but can this also, the things that Mitch laid out, some of the things I laid out, what Oliver will talk about, can that, and how does that resonate also in, Eastern Europe and some of the cities that you're discussing? So, because I'm not an Eastern European specialist, and I'll be very thrilled to learn more about it. And finally, to also think about what I would maybe call a history of the present. Because in the last year and a half, we've seen that science has taken a very central role in, both articulating what the pandemic is about, how it is supposed to be politically dealt with. And so I think we're getting a very interesting contemporary take on the significance of science and what effects it has on urban spatialities, right? Who's allowed to go outside, who's allowed to go where, and how do we quantify populations and those sort of things. So what can we learn maybe from looking at the historical examples we have, also at what we see in the present today? Corona is one example, but there are many others too, where science is playing an increasingly important role in what we think about, the urban or the metropolitan. So with that, thank you very much. I look very much.
Thank you, Dorothee. Now I give the floor to Oliver Hochadel, who is a historian of science and researcher at the Institución Mila y Fontanelas de Investigación en Humanities, or something very similar, in Barcelona, and whose the last 20 years was concerned, among others, with the urban history of science, which he also presents in the article in the volume we're discussing. And I suppose that we'll be continuing with the question of entanglements and Eastern Europe. So Oliver, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. And thank you very much for, hello to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. It has already been said, just like Dorothee, I have been a contributor to this volume. So my commentary will not be, absolutely objective, but maybe it will not be too subjective either, because as mentioned, Dorothee already mentioned, I'm coming a bit from outside. My contribution is a historiographical one. It's not about Vienna. It's about the work I did on, well, second cities in the periphery, and a couple of books I edited in the last years. And as Mitch already said, much of it has to do with the critique of a kind of this assumed center periphery constellation in urban history and in urban history of science. And this has much to do with the fact that I moved to Barcelona and have all this perspective to Latin America. So in my contribution, I talk about interurban knowledge exchange between the supposed second cities, about the concept of, from urban history, transnational municipalism, the idea that particularly small or middle-sized cities exchange practical knowledge of how to run a city, how to improve, renovate, modernize their infrastructures, maybe not so much by looking at the huge metropolis, but rather at cities of similar size with similar problems, similar budgets, similar situations, simply. And that what often is, they're often just perceived as the receiving end of modernization processes and of technological solutions. But I think a closer look shows that there are actually a lot of, well, apart from their own creativity, innovative appropriations of solutions from elsewhere. So the idea is to complicate this picture between science, between kind of these metropolises and those supposed second cities. And my final suggestion is, well, we should maybe discard the concept center periphery as historical categories and only use them as actors categories, because surely for them it played a role how they perceived themselves and how they were going to modernize their city and how they saw themselves with respect to the metropolis. More recently, I have not left urban history of science, but I've moved into, well, as I've already mentioned, a transnational direction, and even what I'm reading up a lot about global history and trying to think, how could I apply those methods to my own work that at the moment has a lot to do with the history of the zoo in the 19th century. And you will forgive me a slight digression, because just today I finished an article on the zoo of Buenos Aires in the early 20th century and its connections with other zoos around the world. And what you see here is an article from an Argentine illustrated journal from October 1911 that shows the animal keeper there in the center, Josef Novacek from the Vienna menagerie Schönbrunn, who had brought a flock of 20 Caracul sheep, what you see in the foreground, by steamer to Buenos Aires. And those sheep, their lambs provide a very specific, very precious pelt. So this is basically an acclimatization sheep. Those sheep come from Central Asia, from the Emirate of Bukhara. They had been brought to Austria in the very early in the 20th century, but not in Vienna, but outside Vienna. They were bred, and now, I don't know, maybe second or third generation of these sheep were, as a gift from the emperor, sent through the Schönbrunn menagerie to Buenos Aires. We see here the arrival at the port, and from there they will move on to a breeding station outside Buenos Aires. So this is kind of the global history of science I'm looking at the moment, and I'm frankly fascinated with, you know, these sheep from Central Asia go via Vienna and being bred in the Alps via steamer to Buenos Aires and end up in in the Pampa. And that provides a little bit of the backdrop to, I'm just, yeah, I can take this off now, to my comments on the book. And first of all, I would like to say that I've been at the conference. I've very much enjoyed the conference. I've now, in the past couple of days, read the entire book, and I think it really achieved what it set out to do, and that's not an easy thing. And I'm referring here in particular to the subtitle, Vienna in Transnational Context. It is much more than just an urban history of science. That all the contributions really take serious this subtitle, looking for this circulation of knowledge in these transnational interurban context. I think this is for me, the most important achievement of this book, and why it should be read and why it should be built up upon. Like, as I've told you, the story of the Caracol sheep between Asia and Latin America. For example, I particularly liked the article by Bru Penalosa and this idea of the Metropolitan exchange system, right? In this case, it's more about ethnographical objects between Vienna, Berlin, and the United States, in particular Chicago. I mean, I think these are the stories we have to research and to write about. Ulrike Spring has this really, I think, very helpful notion and convincing idea of the Arctic as a global space. You know, it's not only up there somewhere in the North Pole. It is transferred into the metropolitan space and adapted and understood and communicated in this very specific metropolitan context. So you can do this with all of the contributions. Marianne Clermont very nicely talks about this international debate this is the mid-19th century on water supply, waste management, you know, how knowledge circulated, how solutions were adapted, and finally, but in an innovative way in Vienna. In Petra Svatek's article, you find kind of fascinating short biographies of geographers from Vienna and Berlin. I was like the example of Eugen Oberhummer and the networks before World War I, but also in the interwar period with geographers from the United States, his journeys, his lecture tours, all of that. That is and her focus on how actively those actors, geographers from Vienna and Berlin, did their networking. And I think this is and geography, of course, is par excellence a discipline for these transnational connections and research. Chandra Bekeshi's article about technological transfer in kind of the third quarter of the 19th century in Vienna helps us to look with new eyes at things we seemingly know. We even see them if we live in Vienna every day, like the Ringstrasse, the correction of the Danube, and the World Exhibition in 1873. He looks at all these kind of events or technologies in a sense with transnational eyes, and it's simply fascinating to see the amount of actors from abroad that appear, and the variety of actors, engineers, private companies that work already then on completely on an international scale. The agency of the engineers in these processes, and how all this was eventually acted out and put into practice and into kind of urban reality in Vienna. So I think all this this transnational perspective really worked when applied to the metropolis of Vienna. And now, I mean, a commentator, I guess, should also ask a little, well, fine, but where do we go from here, and what research questions should we explore next? Well, Dorothee did make already a couple of interesting suggestions. I think in one we kind of overlap. She was talking about Eastern Europe. I'm thinking of the smaller urban centers of the Habsburg monarchy. I think due to the perspective of the book, Transnational, they did not feature much in this book. Well, Johannes Mattes, for example, he talks briefly about the large numbers of scientific societies, well, I think 150, so outside the metropolis of Vienna. Well, so there is a lot of mass of scientific activity and organization that might deserve more study. I am very well aware that many of you, Jan and others, have, of course, worked about this kind of intra-imperial dynamic of knowledge production. My question here is rather, how do we connect these two historiographies, the transnational one and this, well, for want of a better word, intra-imperial dynamics. And finally, I mentioned at the beginning global history, as well, everybody seems to be doing global history these days, it seems at times. And much of the focus of these new approaches are precisely our period, the 19th century, early 20th century, kind of the second globalization. And can we use their concepts? Are they helpful? These concepts, for example, by Christopher Bailey of the kind of the creation of uniformities across the globe, or the concept of integration, what Sebastian Conrad talks in many of his works, in a sense, how things get more alike through interactive processes that we may call globalization. Is there anything useful for us, historians of science, of urban science, in this, or is this transnational approach sufficient? And because they're obviously overlapping anyway, global and transitional. Maybe there isn't much of a difference. I do mention, and maybe I put this in the chat now, there's a group out there called the Global Urban History Project, and I've been at their conference 2 years ago in Leicester. There's the link to their website. They do fascinating work, and they're not historians of science, but it's fascinating to see how they try to connect global history with urban history. Maybe there's also something for us to learn from. And very last point, and I talk a little bit about that in my article. I mean, I moved from Vienna to Barcelona over 13 years ago, and I might be a living example of the fact that our kind of historiographical choices, what we study and how we studied it, are of course determined by our individual trajectories. Had I not moved to Vienna, I might have contributed a paper to this volume in a very different way, maybe on the Schönbrunn menagerie in transnational context. So who knows? So that would be my last point. Reflexivity on our own position as historians of urban science. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. And thank you also for pointing out the direction in which I think the discussion will be now turning to. So now I would like to invite everyone to ask questions. If you have a question, please write a Q or a question mark in the chat so that I know who wants to ask question and that I can make a kind of order. And before, since I don't know anyone, I wanted to ask Mitch, because now you heard a lot of impact and a lot of new ideas, whether you could react briefly and also maybe also say a few words how you see the field of urban science history will be developing in the next years.
Thanks, Jan. I will keep this very brief because I really do want to hear from the people out there who are from so many different countries. I'm really quite gratified. The Zoom really does have an advantage. That particular advantage, it seems to me to be undeniable. The point that Oliver made about the relative lack of attention to the other centers of scientific activity within the Habsburg Empire is, of course, well taken. I mentioned these in my introductions quite specifically when I talked about geographical spaces, the regional being one of them, one of these geographical spaces, alongside the transnational and so on. And I cited, of course, Jan Surman's very important work about the linkages, about the mobility of scholars from Vienna to Prague or Krakow or other such places within the empire, and how differential that was. I found Jan's findings in his book on the subject quite interesting, because Vienna seems to have been the place where everyone, or not everyone, but quite a few, the majority indeed of the professors in Cisleitanian, the Cisleitanian part of the monarchy were trained. And only a few of those folks, once they left Vienna and took positions elsewhere, ever came back to Vienna, which is a very interesting kind of asymmetry. Circulation is not really quite the right word for that process. You could say Vienna was the feeder school. In America, they would say Vienna is the feeder school. It was the training academy. And in a certain sense, that was quite logical, since Vienna was also the capital, and the University of Vienna was the largest university, as it still is, not only in Austria, by the way. Just a little joke on the side, when I asked my German friends, what is the largest German-speaking university, they all scratch their heads and think about maybe Münster or Munich or so on. And when I tell them it's Vienna, and they say, oh, really? And then I say how many students the University of Vienna has, they just can't believe it. It's over 90,000. It's La Sapientia in German, but that's something that's simply not on the map for most people, how large the University of Vienna even still is now. It wasn't quite that predominant in the Habsburg period, but it was the only university in the German-speaking world for a time anyway, with more than 10,000 students, which was quite unusual in those days. Berlin reached that number also, but only shortly before the First World War. Anyway, going back to Oliver's point, I did mention in the introduction that there were these regional networks, which in which places like Prague or Krakow served as centers within those regions. And that is, of course, important. We need a layered concept of space here. And simply a metropole-centered concept is not what I was at least interested in developing. It's simply not the case. It's multi-centered already in the 19th century. And that's important, of course, if you want to think about what happened after 1918, because the successor states took advantage of the already existing network conditions in many cases and developed new networks with the formerly, shall we say, middle level centers, now the only center, say Prague being a very clear example of that, Budapest, any case. Krakow is less clear, but those are issues that we can pursue not only with regard to the late 19th century, but going into the 20th century as well. The language issue would become very important if we did that. I don't want to go into that here, but unless someone else wants to do that. I see Anna Shimosh is here, and I don't want to ignore the fact that Lisbon is, of course, also a colonial metropole. but at the same time is regarded as peripheral, in quotes, in Europe. And the people working in Lisbon see themselves that way as well. So you have a dual consciousness here. And that is quite interesting as well from both a spatial and a cultural point of view. So there's plenty of ways of looking at the issue of social space, geographical space, and the like. But I don't think that the ones I've mentioned are the only ones.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm still waiting for questions from the colleagues.
When I have this happen in a seminar, I always say, don't all talk at once.
Oh, now we have, the first question comes from Arne Schirmacher.
Yeah, if I may butt in here just to start a conversation. Probably I was just wondering, I heard a lot of transnational and lots of, say, Austrian cities or the big empire cities. Some names of towns which I missed were something like London or Paris. So I'm just wondering, are there models for this kind of, say, interaction of metropolises with scientific infrastructures, or is every case different? Or did you just conceive that everybody knows about what has happened in Victorian London and probably also in France, in Paris, in the capital? So I was just wondering, so from your wide sweep of, say, trying to get close to this interaction of different, say, historiographical and probably also infrastructural points of views, is there something like, well, we have always special cases, we can see some influences, or are there some model places? And this is probably also in question to Oliver, who has studied Barcelona, but also comparatively. So just enlighten me.
If I may, Oliver, I hope you will say something, but if I may, I would simply like to say that we did not actually discuss that question as we were discussing how to do this volume. And from my own personal point of view, I thought that it was not a good idea to look to London or Paris as models, for the simple reason that in the historiography, London and Paris are the only places even mentioned. And I decided that was not, I didn't want to contribute to that false optic. There are multiple metropoles. And so the idea of saying, quote, us too, or we too with Vienna may seem banal in the sense of saying, well, there was this metropolis and there was that metropolis, as you've suggested. There is a danger in doing that taking of each case as unique, but of course, each case is unique. So the next step would indeed be to look at to see if there are similarities and differences. And I hinted at one in my introductory remarks by pointing out that the Habsburg Empire, as everyone in this chat room hopefully knows, is different from the British or the French Empire in the very simple and obvious sense that it was not an overseas empire, but a land empire. In that sense, it's similar to Russia, but it's in other respects quite different from the Russian Empire. But there's plenty of discussion about that amongst general historians about the different kinds of empires. I didn't see any need for us to repeat that. This is it's very much out there in the general historical literature about how these different kinds of empires worked. There are similarities and differences, and one could run through lists of those. But the one that's important here, I think, is that in the case of Vienna, you have the Novara exhibition that I mentioned, and you do have objects being imported by ships circumnavigating the globe. The British did that already very early in the 18th century and continue to do so. The Darwin Beagle voyage is famous, but it's continued into the 20th century. So these are things that other places did already for a long time before the Habsburgs did the Novara, and the Novara remained a unique case. So that is a difference. The Habsburgs weren't doing that in a systematic fashion. They were doing other things in a systematic fashion. For example, a geographical or a geological survey of the entire empire. I referred to that briefly in my introduction. Others have done a better job of discussing this, Marianne Clémoon in particular. Nation construction by science. Now, this happened in the United States as well. There's the Coastal Survey, and the Geological Survey in the United States. Sorry, that's my telephone. I'll just let them keep doing that. That's the way nations are made in the 19th century, with the help of science and technology. It's not the only way that nations are made, but it's a very important way that nations are made. Now, was the Habsburg Empire a nation? The experts on Habsburg have discussed this back and forth for many years, and the answer is, of course, no. Not in the sense of nation state, as France was. What you have is a kind of, again, a layered space. The motto for these empire-wide projects was Viribus Unitis, which was also the motto of the Kaiser himself, with united forces. Unity in diversity, we would say today, perhaps. Although I'm not sure he would have exactly signed on to that in its current meaning. But you see where I'm getting to, okay? Whereas the French national concept is really quite different from that. And the British, to say they even have a national concept in this sense seems to me a bit strange. So there are plenty of differences, and the similarities are there in as well. And I don't know that there has been a systematic discussion of this topic. So thanks, Arnie, for bringing it up. It's something that needs to be done.
Oliver, Dorothee, do you want to add something?
Very briefly, maybe. I mean, Mitch already, are there models was the question, and Mitch already said, well, as such, no. Each metropolis and also each second city was very different. What many historians of urban historians have argued, that we have to understand these cities as co-constructing each other. They only, in a sense, exist in relation with one another. And if I may illustrate that with the Buenos Aires zoo and its international connection, they were in no way interested in having any connection with any secondary zoo, right? Argentina is a rising nation at around 1900, wants to be the next world global power. They're only interested in having relations with London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, and Washington, right? So in a sense, they construct themselves, the zoo, and of course the city as a new metropolis by linking up with other or with the big ones, and so they kind of increase their recognition and their network through very specifically targeting those other metropolises.
I think what I would maybe just add quickly, because I think, Anna, that's very interesting. And I think we're maybe at a particular sort of historiographical moment too. For so long, we always looked at Paris, Vienna, at the sort of usual suspects. And now we're turning away, or we turned away to also see, you know, just like Mitch said, what's going on in the other cities. But now maybe we're at a point, and I think your question leads us to that, right? Are we now sort of losing sight of, you know, the big players? And so in that sense, I'm sure it will turn back too at some point. But I would say right now, you know, we're at a sort of at a moment to also look at other sites, maybe, since we have a lot of understanding, you know, just like Mitch said, we look at them almost as models, but maybe we look at them as models because most of the work has been done on them, that they appear like models, even though what Oliver just said, they, you know, for a lot of contemporaries, they did serve as models, right? You know, especially, I mean, Buenos Aires might be a special case too, right? Since it was kind of trying to reframe itself as Paris of South America. But I think, you know, that's just what I wanted to point out, that we might have a particular historiographical moment too, that's maybe turning against those usual suspects.
Thank you, Dorothea. And now the question from Sandra Kloss.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to talk about work migration and specifically about what global history lessons we can take and maybe apply there, as global history famously taught us that distances are not what they seem, and places that seem close to each other may, in a globalized world, be very far, and others that seem far may appear very close when it comes to connections between them. And I think of a city like Vienna as there is no one Vienna. It really depends on which district you ask or which group of people you ask, and specifically if you look at districts where there's a larger population of migrants or commuters or rural immigrants, if you want to call them that, then it might look like we have a very different city than what if we just look at the bourgeois scientists that may have had exchanges with, you know, these other metropoles. So I wanted to ask if any of the contributions, which I'm very interested in reading very soon, address that diversity of a city infrastructure, as in a city is not necessarily one city, but multiple cities at a time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Who wants to react to it?
Jan, you could say something about that with your mappings.
My mapping, I mean, this actually, I mean, Sandra asked actually a question which I had in mind also. How can we actually add the subaltern history to the history of urban, urban scholarly spaces? In Vienna, when 1/3 of the population spoke Czech and not German as a first language. And I was also wondering, how can we actually, like, I mean, because when I was reading the book, it seemed to me that the book is about, a lot is about inclusion, and about how this inclusion is, both in a spatial way, transnational and global, and also through the Falls University, how this inclusion is managed on the local level. But I was still wondering, we are still talking about the time and about the space, which is getting a bit exclusive also. And this history of exclusion is actually completely not told in the book. And I was wondering whether it is actually the problem of the approach or not, or is it a problem of history of science, which has problems with exclusion? It doesn't really look at it very often. Whether it's urban history or whether it's like history of Vienna. I mean, I missed it a bit, but I still don't know how to include it into the history of, or into urban history of science. And maybe with this, I will ask once more in Mitch, Dorothea, or Oliver, how you see it, whether it is actually possible to add this broad population which is excluded, how to add it into the story. I know I didn't answer the question, I just made it more complicated, I think.
If I may point this out on Jan's behalf, he has provided information. It's through academia.edu about the addresses of Vienna teaching staff and how they changed over time from the 1850s into the later 19th century. And it's really quite fascinating. So you see there, when I mentioned at the very beginning that these urban space and science are moving targets, this is a very clear illustration of what I was trying to say. Ironically, however, Sandra, the 10th district was then already a district largely populated by non-locals, the so-called Bohemians at the time. They spoke Czech, as Jan said, and working class Viennese, many of whom were not actually from Vienna. So that is indeed a fascinating issue, and the Volksheim in Ottakring was in some respects placed there in order to address this public. Whether the non-German speaking people living there visited the Volksheim or not is something I cannot answer. You would have to ask Christian Stifter that question, the author of the text. And since he runs the archive that has the papers of the Volksheim, he might even be able to answer it. He might even have the enrollment list for some of these courses, and you could actually answer the question whether that outreach succeeded or not. But it is a very good question, Sandra. I think you're absolutely right to bring it up. Migration, of course, means many different things, and this we need to remember as well. It didn't always mean in the 19th century what it means now. Who's migrating? We have to keep asking from where to where. That too is a moving target. And I think it's important to avoid projecting the current situation back onto the past from that respect. In that respect, it's of course true that migration happened then as well as now, but maybe it was rather different, much more regional migration, and a less global one than the current one, current phenomenon that we're looking at. But that's maybe not entirely true. It depends on which metropole you look at. People from Africa are living in Paris already in the 19th century. That's not true in Vienna, with certain very individual exceptions. So you're right to ask the question. One last point on this is, of course, when you ask who's migrating, you also have to ask, when professors move from one place to another, or when a student moves from Budapest to Vienna to study there, or from Prague to Vienna to study there, is that a migration? Maybe. There's a Latin term for it, already being used at the time, actually being used in the medieval period already, called peregrinatio academica. And the motion of students from one place to another is not just a recent phenomenon, it's as old as the university. So that's, of course, an additional kind of topic, but it's not the same thing as you were speaking about when you said migration, I'm pretty sure. So I'm just pointing these things out. The peregrinatio is perhaps more relevant for the history of science, but it's not only relevant for the history of science. It's about the social mobility of people in general in the academic professions, or the pre-academic professions in many cases, because many of them left without ever receiving a degree. It's very common in history of universities for people to misuse the title Wissenschaft when they write about universities, and because they assume that the university has always been a research institution. That's simply not true. It's only become a research institution since the middle of the 19th century. So if you look at the long history of universities, that turns out not to be correct. So that's how complicated these issues can be. All right, I'm just pointing these things out, not really going into detail. But Jan's point about people moving from one part of Vienna to another is very relevant, especially if you look at the teachers of medicine who had been originally living in the first district because that's where their practices were. And when the medical school, the medical part of the medical faculty of the university, now a separate university, but then a faculty within the University of Vienna, becomes ever more scientific in its structure and has to have more buildings in order to have its laboratories set up, and they can't do it all in one building anymore, they move. Not all of them, but many of them move into the 9th district so they can be closer to those new laboratory buildings. This is fascinating, but is that a migration? I don't think so. The numbers are too small. But it is movement, and it needs to be registered because it's relevant for the history of science.
Okay, thank you, Mitch. Dorothea, Oliver, do you want to add something on this question?
No, I don't. And I think there are still a number of other questions and given the time. So, but I think it's a great question that definitely we need to keep in mind, right? Because it goes towards a multiplicity of actors, right? Who have different positions in the area of, science as well. So.
Thank you. And then I would suggest that we go further with questions as we have it on the list. So now, Katrin Ahrens.
Hi, thank you for a set of interesting presentations. I'd like to also not complexify the questions on the table, but I think in a very important way. Dorothee Brantz used the word big players. We've heard center periphery. Jan Surman just talked about subalternity, lots of words about center and periphery. And I'm wondering if we're not running the danger of conflating or essentializing size and power. And by this, I mean a concept like Sasha Saskin's notion of global cities. That is, these places who are part of a network that have extraordinarily greater impact and longer standing impact than their size or whatever would do. And it's kind of like that there's a hidden network of professionals. That is what is really going on. The concept of global cities came up as an economic dominance question. And it turns out that a lot of the cities that are transshippers are more important than the producers. And so these are, completely third world places where barges happen. But without them, the whole network would die. The recent Suez Canal block shows you that. And so I'd like to suggest maybe that we need to talk about some of these global cities situations. Deborah Cohen's book on the Exners, for example, suggests the Salzkammergut in the summer might have been a global city, just because all of Vienna was out there and mixing in a different way. On a more global network, the Colorado School of Mines and one place for Universität für Bodenkultur in the GDR in the 80s were the two best and only places where you could do deep drilling physics on a global level. So they were the people that everyone knew you could find them in disciplines like archaeology and some kinds of anthropology. The most important universities and sites are in small cities closer to the sites. And so what I'm suggesting is that a place like Vienna isn't a network, it's overlaced with sets of networks that actually need to be disambiguated. So it isn't just Paris, London, Vienna. It's who are the players on global networks, who are, so not just global cities, but global nodes in the science world. So again, deep drilling physics is weird, but without it, there is no deep oil and crust things. Shipping is another issue that would fit in this. Places within, and also in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the fact that so many of the smaller post-secondary high schools got promoted into specialty post-secondary institutions. So certain schools of mines, gardening institutions that became Universität for agriculture and things like this. But these have to be paid more attention to. They're very stable in a lot of cases, but they have nothing to do with size. They have to do with specialization and depth.
Thank you, Katrin. And I see already Dorothea wants to answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I would love to, if you could maybe write in the chat that Salzkammergut in the summer, the citation, because I'd love to look at that. And I think you are absolutely right that there are many different places. And I think you interestingly at the end brought up the notion of nodes, right? Because it's not networks that are only linked to, you know, sort of particular cities, but there are certain nodes, right? And there can be for specific things, can lie in different places. But I guess what characterizes metropoles in that sense, and this is the argument, you know, that Saskia Sassen is making too, that these global cities, they bring together not just one specific thing, right? There's not just like a good university, or there is a particular, or even in a particular discipline, but there are many different things, right? I mean, what characterizes the global city is not just that it is, you know, the place for corporate headquarters, but it's also the banks and the insurance and all the other, you know, sort of institutions that are linked to it. And I think maybe that is something that we see in the metropoles, more sort of a diversification. But I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that we need to look at different aspects, which I think raises the notion of scale, right? And that's something we need to look at and have a much more sort of intricate understanding that nodes are not just about size, and there I'm totally with you, right? We do need to look, you know, across different scales, and then also look at, you know, what sort of the specificities are, and how they, you know, kind of make a really tight network, what I would call entanglements, right? So that it's not even just about networks, because networks quickly lead us to sort of certain places. But if we maybe think more about the entanglements, then it can go in many different directions, right? Then Vienna is not just linked to Berlin and other big cities, you know, but it's linked just as much to Salzkammergut, you know, if you sort of look at, you know, the entanglements it has. So thank you for the question.
Can I just react a minute? Is that I'd like to make very clear that this network idea, the global cities idea, is somewhat antithetical to the whole notion of how many resources are in one place. It's a question of a critical network node. And again, I point you back at the Suez Canal last month. World trade stopped because one barge full of toys stuck. And that is a completely the lowest tech. It only does one thing, but it's done one thing forever, and without it, we all die. So that's why it's a flow concept and not a structural concept.
Thank you. Mitch, Oliver, do you want to add something?
The concept of global cities clearly comes from economic history, and as I don't have a problem with it, but I really do have a problem with simply arbitrarily transferring concepts from one kind of history to another kind of history without doing a little bit of thinking about how to do that. I'm not sure if there is a global city in the history of science, then it's London. But otherwise, it may be Paris for a while, but I'm not quite sure what it would mean to call them that. Nodes in the network is, of course, right. Networks consist of nodes, but some nodes are thicker than other nodes. So I'm not sure how far you get with just using the word node in that circumstance. You still have to look at how thick the nodes are in the sense of how many connections run through them to do network theory in that way. But I'm not objecting to it. I'm just saying it takes work.
Oliver, do you wanted to add something?
No, I think Robert Budd wants to add something.
Robert, please unmute yourself.
I want to ask a question not about economic centrality, but about cultural centrality, and particularly about the Germanophone, about language. That my impression is that in the period your book is covered, the Germanophone area would have been considered the center of the scientific world. London, the English certainly saw Germany as the center of the places where you should go and study, and probably research as well. I've seen it in the article, even of the British War Minister, R.B. Haldane, who spent his summers, he had studied in Göttingen and would come every year on holiday to Germany in Easter for 15 years before the war. And I wonder to what extent actually Vienna needs to be located within a Germanophone area, which in turn is a central part of the cultural world for science.
So Oliver,
don't all talk at once. Robert, this is an excellent question, but we do not have the data to answer it properly. There is good work on Americans who went to Germany to study. There's good individual studies of British people who went to Germany to study. Göttingen was indeed a favored place, but Heidelberg in particular also. Berlin later, but not the whole for the whole period. We have some pretty good data for the German universities, but it's still not comprehensive. Vienna, not so much. There's very good, the peregrinatio that I mentioned before has been very well studied for Hungarian students going other places. And Berlin is indeed a favored location unless you're a chemist. Then you go to Heidelberg to study with Bunsen. Those things are indeed, there is data on those things, Robert, so you're quite right to point them out. Whether the German language is the relevant issue is perhaps not so clear as many German scholars have assumed that it was. They went to these places because the kings of the discipline were there. In some cases, however, they also went to the place because having studied in Germany gave you prestige at home. So both possibilities are indeed in the room in the 19th century. It depends on which students you're talking about and what level of study we are at, right? So when you talked about, Robert, about places to go to do research, that's a different level of study from someone who's simply going abroad to spend a year abroad and maybe becomes a scientist after that. Those things need to be kept separate somehow, but it's very difficult to do with statistical data. You have to go into the biographies to do that. Vienna is a central location for students coming from the Habsburg monarchy, but not to the same extent all the time. Hungarians don't come to Vienna in a consistent manner. They come at certain periods and not in others. And that's why that's so, I can't pretend to say. But those things need to be studied more. Whether there was a time when there was talk of Vienna being part of the German system of science in the sense that there were star professors who were appointed in Leipzig and then moved to Vienna, or the other way around. Ludwig Boltzmann is a very famous example, but of course he's very exceptional and not typical. And there was a lot of mistaken generalizations made about the mobility of academics on the basis of these individual stars. If you actually look at professors in a particular discipline as a group, it doesn't look quite that way. But it's certainly true that the Viennese wanted very much to get Germans appointed to professorships in Vienna when they were regarded as high-class scholars. And they sometimes succeeded. Wilhelm Schere in Germanistic is a famous case amongst the Germanist scholars. Everyone now likes to hammer on that man, but he became indeed the founding professor of Germanistic after he moved to Vienna. So these things did happen. It can be demonstrated in individual cases in particular disciplines that it happened. But around shortly before 1900, it stopped happening. Why? Because the ministry in Vienna capped salaries for full professors and eliminated Kollegiengeld. And that just simply made it extremely difficult for the faculties to get the people they wanted to come from Germany to come to Vienna. And some German Viennese, so to speak, went back to Germany after that happened. These are fairly banal stories, but they're of course quite relevant more relevant for the history of science than many historians of science would care to admit.
Thank you, Mitch. Since we are slowly running out of time and still have 4 questions, I would suggest that we gather the questions 2 and 2. So now we will have Anna Shimosh and Gary Cohen. So Anna.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many colleagues. To be brief and for a change, I won't speak about center and periphery, although Mitch suggested that. I will just add that besides the dual role of Lisbon, periphery within Europe and the center in respect to its colonies, in fact, even if we think within Europe and in the relations of Europe with the world, then it's central again, because it's in between the Europe, United States, Africa, and so on and so forth. But I want to ask a question about the concepts which Mitch has used in his introduction and in his presentation, and most specifically scientific infrastructures and spaces of knowledge. I mean, we have been discussing quite often technical infrastructures, what we often call gray infrastructures, or if we want to extend the concept a little bit further, we can talk about green infrastructures. I would like to understand exactly what is the advantage of talking about scientific infrastructures in the sense that it looks to me that you have there almost everything and you are not discriminating anymore. So there must be an advantage which I'm not catching. The other thing is spaces of knowledge. In a book about transnational dimensions, it looks to me that spaces of knowledge are very much connected to the different dimensions or scales of urban connections inside the city with other spaces, or even intellectual, social, as you very well mentioned. So spaces look to me to crystal, I mean, they are more static. And in a book on transnational dimensions, why are these connections and dynamic connections hidden inside a concept such as spaces of knowledge? So that's it.
And Gary Cohen.
I just wanted to raise a conceptual, or if you like, institutional point and reinforce something implicit in what Katie Ahrens said. And I was thinking, as Mitchell Ash talked about the centrality among the Cisleithanian universities of the Vienna University and its much greater size, I was wondering what we would find if we asked about the Technische Hochschulen, later promoted to the status of Technische Universitäten. There's a tendency in a lot of these discussions to focus on the universities as such, and that crowds out the Technische Hochschulen. But they did have the ranks of Hochschulen in Central Europe by 1900. There was scientific work, whether pure or applied, being done at them. And I wonder in Imperial Austria whether the Vienna Technische Hochschule had quite the primacy that the university did. I think it was certainly larger than the others in Austria, in Cisleithania, but perhaps not quite the primary role. But in any case, I think we need to keep them in the picture and not ignore them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. So Mitch, Dorothee, Oliver, do you want to react?
I think this is Mitch's field.
I think so too.
Thanks. I will try to keep this very brief. Gary, to Gary, I can simply say that your suspicions are surely well taken, but we simply do not have the data on the on circulation amongst the technical Hochschulen to answer your question. It would be good if we did, but we do not. I think there probably was circulation, but it is quite possible that it was not as intense amongst the technical Hochschulen, because many of them were more oriented to the Gewerbewirtschaft in their cities. So it was much more likely for the folks to circulate from the economy to the Hochschule and back in one place rather than to change locations. But that may not be true of everyone. It's simply something I can't comment on because we don't have the information that we need to answer your question, but it's a very good question. The Hochschule für Bodenkultur that Catherine Ahrens mentioned is actually not in Berlin, but in Vienna, and it was indeed established by the ministry in order to be a node in the network for the entire empire, for people to come and study agronomy and forestry. And it actually served that function, it seems to me. Although, again, here too, we don't have the quantitative information to actually prove it at that point. To Anna's question, perhaps that we just need to talk a little more about the concepts in my introduction and to clarify some things that may not have been completely understood because I was talking so fast. The concepts of space that I was trying to layer in that introduction are layered indeed, and that means that, of course, they are not static. I keep talking about moving concepts and dynamism in the introduction, and point out that as all of us surely know, space is not something that is quote unquote out there, but is actually constructed by individuals in motion. Cultural imaginaries create spaces in many ways, and they change also. So it's not easy to get a handle on these concepts in the way that one used to think you could get a handle by naming something and you then had something static. It's not the case in this. So we agree, I believe, actually, about these issues. I was simply trying to come up with a set of layered spaces that give people an idea of the complexity of the situation we're in order to put the transnational into some kind of perspective. That was the aim. That the Viennese metropolis is very local in many respects, I also tried to emphasize. Once those buildings are actually there, the Natural History Museum, the university, the new building of the academy, you really do have a set of really beautiful historicist buildings amongst which the scientific elite physically circulates by foot. And that says something about a place, that they do that. In other places like London, you can only do that in Bloomsbury, but not in the whole city, at least not without a carriage. Those things make a difference in the way scientific activity is organized, it seems to me. That's all I was really trying to say with the concept.
Okay, thank you, Mitch. And now we have the last set of questions. The first question by Shoshana, and then I will read the question by Peter Rumpold. So, Shoshana.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity for asking questions about the book that one hasn't read. So I will ask a totally heuristic question. We know that the history of the Habsburg monarchy is preferred as a sort of a model for a historical model for, I don't know, managing diversity, something like an avatar or a forerunner of the EU, or more recently, the successor states or the post 1918 situation is being taken as a sort of a ground zero for dismantling sovereignty. And I was just wondering, to what extent, I mean, is there is there something that Vienna as a scientific metropolis stands for or might stand for? I am aware this is a very intuitive question, but I am wondering whether you, the authors of this volume, have been reflecting on this question and whether this makes sense to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Shusha. And the question by Peter Rumpold is if you could clarify a bit about where the sources for the chapters are coming from, that biographies which were mentioned, but what more than biographies is statistical data or further documents. So that would be the question. So that would be the two questions. And I would also suggest that the two questions would be also then the chance for you, Mich, Dorothee, and Oliver to make also final statements for our discussion. So please, whoever wants to go first.
I would prefer to go last.
Okay, so I'll go first. And thank you, Susanna. I can speak, I guess, just from my example, looking at natural history museums and zoological gardens. And there I would say, yeah, you can see something specific about Vienna that has to do very closely with its urban history. And that is the creation of scientific institutions in sort of a architectural uniformity. I mean, the Ringstrasse is like, a very good example for sort of urban transformation, urban reinvention in many different ways, right? I mean, for cultural institutions, for political institutions, but also for scientific institutions, right? And I think the fact that the Natural History Museum, and I looked at this in a number of different cities, the fact that the Natural History Museum is part of a whole, right next to the Art Museum, it integrates science in a sort of very representative network that expresses itself architecturally, but it also expresses itself with regard to how, well, what I was talking in my article, how this sort of outside is in conversation with the inside. If you look at the facade of the building and how that, sort of already gets into dialogue with what you will see inside. And that's quite remarkable, I think, in Vienna. I mean, you see this, and nowadays you see a movement more and more towards creating these museum campuses in different cities to bring this together. In Berlin, you didn't see that at all. The Natural History Museum was sort of a little bit off the beaten path. And you see this in a number of other cities as well. I think there, London is actually an interesting example, because there you also have sort of this connection of museums, but in most cities you don't, right? I mean, and how they're sort of connected, it says a lot about the position, right? I mean, the fact that you have the Natural History Museums in Paris, for instance, at the Jardin des Plantes, right next to the museum. I mean, it says something about how, these institutions were integrated as sort of either scientific and what their sort of public notion was. So I think there is something to be said. And I thought Vienna was quite, I don't know if it's like totally exceptional, but definitely quite outstanding in the sense how it integrated, sort of urban architecture with your sort of a new form of institutionalization. So that, kind of gives it a centrality that in many other cities, and my comparison was Berlin, in Berlin, it definitely doesn't. Right. So, if we look here where the Museum of Technology is, natural science and the art, it's all over the place. Right. I mean, so, and the art museums, they have a Museumsinsel, but not, sort of the other museums, to create sort of an integration of, what museums and their educational and scientific expectations are.
Thank you, Dorothee. Now, Oliver.
Yeah, what I have to say does not really refer to the last two questions that were asked. I'm freewheeling a little bit, trying to resume a few points that have been mentioned before. Talking about networks and nodes and all the rest of it, I think we all agree that we also have to keep in mind that we have to look at individual biographies, individual agendas, trajectories, and to to give enough attention to these biographies. I apologize for again coming up with my Argentine example, because my head is overflowing with that. But this is also referring to what Sandra Close said earlier on. When I hear migration, I don't think of migration within a city. I think of migration between continents. And if you look at Argentine science around 1900, they're virtually all the actors are first or maybe second generation immigrants, right? They're all from Europe. And many of them have made their degree at European universities before migrating as a 25-year-old or so. And they're the leading elite there, right? The country was, well, I exaggerate, but was largely empty until the late 19th century. So we have a very, very specific situation here. So this is the elite level, but at the same time, we have what they call the swallows, the golondrinas, the workers, the real immigrants, but they go back and forth often, right? They work in the summer in Italy, and in the southern summer, and in the European winter, they work in Argentina. They go back every year, right? But we also have kind of the more subaltern knowledge producers, say and political revolutionists, all the anarchists that go back and forth all the time between France, between Spain, Italy, and Argentina. So it's like a spinning wheel going back and forth, where the people themselves go back and forth, but also, of course, the information in the network, well, keeps growing, keeps changing. That's as Mitch repeatedly said, that's a very it's in movement all the time. So and coming back to the book, Science in the Metropolis, I think that there are some very good starters and pointers for us, focusing on individual biographies and their transnational, well, in parts transnational biographies, if we think of Franz Boas and others. So I think that in terms of future research agenda, I think it will help us to ground a little our research, to look more at individual trajectories with all the problems of generalization and so on and so forth. We might also be able to get at people that like such as that animal keeper I showed, Josef Novacek, like who went also several times back with animal transports between Trieste and Buenos Aires, and that might also make our research a bit more, I don't know, palatable and give us other narratives to tell our audiences. And there are at least 2 or 3 authors of the book, contributors of the book in the audience. They might have to say something as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. And Mitch, the final word goes to you.
Thank you. To Suja's question, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood it very well, but I think that there is a sense in which metropoles as centers of power are both comparable with one another and unique, for the simple reason that they are all centers of power and therefore are comparable with one another, but the kinds of power, the way they exercise power is different, because the political entities of the center of which, the center of power of which they are different. So you have both, you have similarities and differences for that simple structural reason. That's a very simple-minded answer to your very interesting and complex question, but I hope we have the chance to talk about it at greater length another time. To Peter Humboldt's question, I'm sorry to say that it would take another half an hour to answer that question about the sources appropriately, because each chapter has different sources. But statistics do not play much of a role. But in most of the chapters, archival material plays a role, and primary source literature from the period plays an important role. Those are the major sources in general. The study by Johannes Mattes on the scientific associations is based on original research that he has done by surveying the Vereinsregister and other sources, including the archives of or publications of these Vereine, which no one has done before him. So it's really quite original, but it's not biographies. In the case of two of the principal actors in his story, however, who were involved in the Association for Speleology or cave research, their biographies were researched by Johannes. So you have different kinds of source material being brought together in an individual chapter, and that's true, I think, across the board in each of the chapters. There are only different kinds of source materials. That's all I can say in a short space of time. And I want to thank everyone for your really fascinating and interesting questions that have been thought-provoking for me, and I'm sure also for the other authors of the volume who are in this chat room.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch, and also thank you everyone for being with us, and especially thank you to Dorothee and Oliver once more for your comments and the discussion. And I think like one of the things that got clear, and it actually connects to the last question, the last answer, is that the urban history of science is also a rereading of the sources which we already have, which, for example, was, although I never contributed with a chapter, I contributed with a presentation, and I took sources which were there, like visible, printed for 100, sometimes some more years, just because they were put in the context of the urban history of science. They provided a very, very interesting insights. And I think that this kind of rereading is something that urban history of science gives us on this many levels on which urban history of science is moving. And with this, I hope for many more interesting and fruitful discussions, both in HPS.CESEE and in the urban history networks. And I'm wishing every one of you a great evening, great Monday evening or Monday morning, wherever you are. I know we have someone from Vancouver in the chat. So we are also a very nice global network, and thank you once more, and see you soon online or hopefully also offline. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Jan, for hosting us.
Thank you very much, Jan.
I certainly second and third that. Sorry, everyone, I have to go to moderate another panel discussion in 10 minutes, so I can't stand around and continue this conversation here. Thanks very much for agreeing to participate. I was very happy that both of you, Dorothee and Oliver, agreed to do so spontaneously. I guess we hit the right time frame, Jan, and that was a good thing.
It was really a great discussion. It really, I think it was the discussion with the biggest audience so far we had.
Great, thank you.
So thanks, and bye, Mitch, and bye, Oliver, and bye, everyone hiding behind the invisible cameras.
Okay, bye-bye, Jan, bye-bye, Mitch.